my friends, and welcome back to Player Display for another PODguy podcast. I am sorry I do not have another action figure review for this week. That's something that I would love to be able to do every single week, but that's just not a possibility with financial constraints and all of that. So in exchange, that's why I have a whole bunch of tier lists and rankings and podcast ideas lined up, just so we have a little bit of something to keep the channel going and there's not too much dead space in between each video that I put up. And besides, again, as I've said, I really do thoroughly enjoy doing either reviews or podcasts. I just find them both equally enjoyable. I have no issue putting them together, and I hope you all get something good out of them too. So, last one we did, we ranked the Batman villains, which was quite a blast. I really enjoyed that, and obviously it would only be natural for us to flip over from DC to Marvel and talk about Spider-Man villains. I think those are probably my two favorite superheroes, being Spider-Man and Batman. Don't ask me to choose which one's on top, because that's very difficult. I love Superman too. Those are like my top three, but Superman doesn't have as big of a rogues gallery in the films, but Spider-Man definitely does. So we're going to go ahead, go through each film, go through almost every single villain. I mean, like, where do you draw the line between a main villain and kind of just this low-key grunt kind of just barreling around the background, right? Hard to say, but we got the main players here in this list. I tried looking for the best list that I could on Tier Maker. I unfortunately couldn't find a good one that also included Across the Spider-Verse. Yeah, we will be talking about those two movies as well, or at least Into the Spider-Verse, but it does have two villains within Across the Spider-Verse, so I do still want to talk about them. So I've already pre-arranged all the characters here based on the films they've released on. So we have like the Raimi-verse, then we've got the Andrew Garfield universe, then we've got the MCU, and then we've got the animated films, so like Miles Morales and all that. Once we get there, then that's when we'll talk about the two other villains, who are the Spot and arguably 2099, who's a little ambiguous, so we'll see what we could do with him when we do get to those characters. Haven't really pre-thought where everyone's going to go on this list. It's going to be pretty random as we go. So I see a villain, talk about them based on what I can remember, and we go from there. It's going to be pretty sporadic. And as a final note, once again, totally subjective list. I'm not going over these based on how they were objectively used in the films, whether they were indeed a good villain or a bad villain, whether they were well acted or not, just simply on how much I enjoyed them, how much they resonate with me, because that's something I can say in concrete. Yes, I enjoy these characters, or I really hate these characters, or perhaps I feel neither way about them. So yeah, pretty standard. We're going to go from S tier to F tier. We know what this all means. S tier, they're very special, near and dear to my heart. F tier pretty much means they might have some redeeming qualities, but I really just don't care about them either way. So, and also, of course, because we have Spider-Man No Way Home, that's when a lot of villains came back. I will also be considering their redemption or their rolling back when that film comes into play with any of those villains. So anyways, enough of those precedents. Let's get into the actual list. So obviously this starts off with Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin, who is, of course, the very first time I've ever seen a Green Goblin. I don't think I've watched any of the Raimi movies in theaters, which kind of sucks. Might have seen 3. I doubt that, though. But I was a little kid when these movies were coming out. I was born in 99, and then I believe the first Spider-Man movie came out in 2002, very early on. So I was kind of growing up as those movies were popping out. And I most have memories with Spider-Man 3. We'll talk about that when we get there. But as for Green Goblin, there is so much to discuss about him. And I feel like he's definitely one of the most complex villains there is. Of course, you have Norman Osborn. He builds up this technological empire in the form of Oscorp. And he is effectively booted out of his own throne because they just simply didn't like the way that he was orchestrating his various experiments. So he said, well, in order to, as in an act of spite and to prove that I know what I'm doing, I'm going to go ahead and inject this super magical serum into myself and see what happens, and then he becomes the Goblin. Or rather, he doesn't directly become the Goblin, so black and white, but rather the Goblin is put into himself, and then you have this duality. So you have Norman, who's a very good and loving scientist, And then you have the total maniac who is the Goblin. So I really love how we have almost these two characters in one. And in a way, he's kind of the perfect foil for Spider-Man. Like, for Spider-Man, at least he has a choice. But as we see for Goblin, especially in No Way Home, he doesn't really have a choice. There are certain personalities within him that are either there or are not there. It's really hard to tell whether we're actually talking to Norman Osborn or if it's simply the Green Goblin masquerading as Norman to simply get his way and to appear as a friend when he really is the devious monster that is sort of trying to orchestrate this maniacal plan to really just create absolute chaos. He's not very political. He's not very scheming. All he really wants to do at the end of the day is cause destruction, cause havoc, and ruin Peter Parker's life. In fact, all three of their lives, because there's three Peters as far as this Goblin is concerned. So, he is expertly portrayed in the first film that he showed up in, being the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. And then I think he was improved in Spider-Man No Way Home because, again, it played more into that duality of as to whether he is Norman or if he's Goblin. Does he have control over which identity is inhabiting this body? And that just makes him really fascinating of a villain. And in terms of the stakes, in terms of the consequence that he has towards the various Spider-Men, of course, he's more closely tied to Tobey Maguire, Peter 1, rather, and he's the first villain that he ever fought. In that first movie, he was very consequential in that, of course, he just wanted to kill everything. He almost blew up a bridge. But beyond that, he was pretty straightforward. He wasn't very complex yet. Not to say he was a bad villain. He was just the launching point for Spider-Man in the cinematic universe of things. But by the time he gets No Way Home, that's really when he starts to become a lot more multifaceted. He actually becomes a lot more sympathetic. And he's, as much as we're enjoying the bad guy in him, we similarly want the good guy in him to succeed, to overcome his demons. And unfortunately, by the time that does happen, when he gets injected with that antidote, he winds up killing Aunt May, which has a very big effect on Tom Holland's Spider-Man. So he is really consequential towards two of them. Not as much Andrew Garfield. I don't think they really do scuffle with each other at any point, but yeah, they do exist within the same universe at one time, at one point. But as for the two bookend Spider-Men, he is extremely significant to both of their journeys. For Tobey being the launching point for him being Spider-Man, and as for Tom Holland, obviously killing his surrogate Uncle Ben, being the Aunt May, since we never saw his Uncle Ben. But Aunt May is the one who gives him the, with great power comes great responsibility. And then right after that, she dies. And then that's what builds up this pepped-up rage that every Spider-Man's supposed to have. And then you have the two former veteran Spider-Men kind of come into play and tell Tom Holland, we know where you've been. This is just going to lead down a path of destruction and mayhem. And then we sort of see everything come to a head when Tom Holland's in the perfect place to kill Norman Osborn, but refrains from doing so. So in terms of sculpting out at least two of the Spider-Man stories, the Green Goblin does his job just fine in both of them. And also, Willem Dafoe's amazing in absolutely everything he does. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this guy up into S tier. I think he is my favorite Spider-Man villain in the cinematic universe. Of course, he plays a much bigger part in the comics. But as for the films, I think it never gets better than Goblin between his two appearances. Moving on to Spider-Man 2, we have Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius. Also very well performed. I didn't connect with Spider-Man 2 as much as a film as much as I did with Spider-Man 1 for whatever reason. I think it's simply... Sorry, I forgot to turn off my notifications again. But I think it's simply on the fact that I watched 1 and 3 a lot more than I watched 2. But 2, objectively, is a good movie. It talks about... it's the first time where you see a superhero... Well, not the first time. You saw it with Christopher Reeve's Superman in Superman 2. But at least for Spider-Man, this is the first time when we see a Spider-Man coping with whether they want to continue being the hero or not. And of course, in between all this, you have another crazed scientist being Doc Ock, who, very similarly to Norman Osborn, kind of just wants to prove that his science is successful. So he takes it upon himself to install the 4 arms into his back, and then it obviously drives him crazy, and it kind of takes over his mind. But one thing I don't think that holds him back a little bit from Green Goblin is, with Doc Ock, you always feel like he has a choice in the matter. Like, with Norman Osborn, it's a little bit more critical because he needs a certain dosage of a drug in order to separate the two identities. So it's a little bit more crucial, it's a lot more urgent. But for Doc Ock, I feel like he just gets injured a few times. He's like, wait, I'm awake now. All right, I'm taking charge. Then he's suddenly in charge of the arms once again. So I never feel like he quite has an arc quite as much, so to speak. Like, if he'd have it any other way, he'd want to be the hero. And that's kind of what you see in No Way Home. And that's where I get a little confused. Like, as soon as he arrives in No Way Home, he's trying to attack Peter Parker, but it was already well established in Spider-Man 2 that he had that pseudo arc of being, no, I want to be the good guy. I want to do what's right for science. So, I don't know. I just feel like they tried doing the same arc twice, and it doesn't really work for me as well. So, yeah, I just feel like he's so similar to Green Goblin in terms of them both being very well-renowned scientists, both being semi-father figures that Peter really looks up to, and then they go bad because of their obsession with science. But I think it simply comes down to the fact that Green Goblin poses a bigger threat. He's a little bit more personable, and I felt a little bit more bad for him for some reason because he lost his business. He had that issue with relating to his son Harry Osborn, who we'll talk about a little bit later. I don't know. I'm getting a little off track, but I simply prefer Green Goblin a little bit more as this scientist gone bad archetype. That's the best way to put it. But as for Otto Octavius, I don't think there is much wrong with this character. Just simply, No Way Home tries redoing his arc, and then he becomes a somewhat heroic figure by the end. But as a villain, I never felt quite as threatened. I mean, then again, he is trying to harness the power of the sun in the palm of his hands, which you could argue is a little bit more dangerous than Green Goblin, who has no plan. But that's what makes Goblin so scary. Because he has no plan, you have no idea what he's going to do next. Ock has a plan, thus making him a little less scary, but arguably a little more dangerous within the confines of that one film in which he is definitely a villain. But in No Way Home, kind of similarly to Green Goblin, he masquerades as being on one side when he's really on the other side. Like, you see Ock pretend to be the villain for a while, then he starts injecting the serums into all the other villains. But of course then you have Goblin, who pretends to be a man who wants to redeem himself, but then it was Goblin the whole time. So, I don't know, they're both objectively equally good in my eyes, but I've always just preferred Goblin. So, for that reason, we're going to be pretty fair here. I'll put Ock in the B tier. Not quite A, just because I never resonated with him as much, but he doesn't deserve lower than B. I think he's solid. Wish he was executed a little bit better in No Way Home, but that being said, he's fine. I think he's a very enjoyable villain. Speaking of villains, there's a whole lot to talk about in Spider-Man 3, so let me take a sip of water here. As I do in pretty much every podcast. Gold star to whoever can count how many times I've taken a sip of water in a podcast. But Spider-Man 3, the reason why... Alright, first of all, not a great movie. It's got a lot of issues. It's definitely the weakest of the Raimi trilogy. Not Raimi's fault at all. It was studio interference. Just got overcrowded, overbusy, and got very confusing as a result. Some villains were greater than others. But all that being said, Sandman, this is the villain that the movie was meant to focus on if Raimi had his way. Unfortunately, it didn't play out that way. But that being said, the little we got of him was pretty damn excellent. You have just a guy, simply a rogue criminal who would totally blend into the crowd if the circumstances were otherwise. But his only goal is to simply save one person, kind of like when we talked about Mr. Freeze from Batman and Robin before. He's not a straight-up villain. He's simply a guy who wants to save a single human being, who is his daughter. So he goes out, commits crime, accidentally commits manslaughter in Uncle Ben, which is a retcon that I definitely don't prefer. Except for the fact that it does cause him a great weight of guilt. He doesn't like the fact that he's against the law here. All he wants is to have enough money to save his daughter. And then he gets trapped in that sand combine thing that turns him into the Sandman. Again, by way of crazy science stuff, he becomes our Sandman. And he uses that power to expedite his plan, to save his daughter a little bit faster, pretty much. And then he sees Spider-Man, and he just simply sees him as a hindrance to his plan. But he has no idea that that Uncle Ben is, of course, Spider-Man's uncle. So he doesn't see the personal issue dynamic between himself and Spider-Man initially. So he just sees him as a distraction, which is why he wants to defeat him later on, and then he teams up with Venom and that whole shenanigans and whatever. And then it comes to the point where he does realize, holy crap, this is the guy whose uncle I killed. This is the biggest burden that I have, aside from wanting to save my daughter. And then the film ends on, admittedly, a very poignant note. Like, I think all the Sandman stuff was done right in a film that's otherwise very muddy. What the crap was that? My neighbors are really loud. But then you get this moment with him in front of Peter, and he says, I'm sorry for what I did. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope that you can understand. But Peter says, no, I forgive you, straight up. Which is a great summation of the arcs for both of them, and then Sandman kind of just drifts away to an unknown fate. Until we get to No Way Home, where I feel like he was severely underutilized. He kind of just shows up, he's trying to help out Peter. I mean, we don't know how he died, so that was a little bit strange. I guess you just have to assume at some point in the Maguire timeline he died somehow. We'll never know how, but yeah, he doesn't have much to do in the film, except for simply saying, no, I want to keep my powers and keep being the bad guy, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the whole crux of his arc is trying to save his daughter, but his daughter doesn't exist in this universe, so I guess in No Way Home his only goal is self-preservation, just to be sure that he survives on. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot else to say about him in No Way Home. He gets cured, he's like, okay, I'm done doing my own villain thing, and then he disappears into the stars and whatever. So he's definitely done a lot better in Spider-Man 3 than he has done in No Way Home. So, pretty concrete, I enjoy this villain. I think I enjoy him a little bit more than Doc Ock, because again, whenever I think of Doc Ock, I just start thinking about Green Goblin. So I'll give Sandman... I'll give him a higher B. That seems about right to me. So, okay. Then we have New Goblin. Talk about a character created to sell toys. I remember, that's my big memory for Spider-Man 3. All the toys being absolutely everywhere for Venom, for New Goblin, for Sandman, in the McDonald's kids meals and stuff like that. New Goblin did not last long. He was amnesiac for most of the film. There's not a whole ton to say about him, except for when he is a threat, he's a pretty intimidating threat. But he doesn't last that way for very long. I think when I prefer him most is less when he's like winking at Peter Parker, a truck passes by, then he disappears, and all that cheesy campy whatever that happens in Spider-Man 3. I really love when he does change face and he decides my friends are more important than having this vendetta against Peter, who actually didn't kill my father. Then he finally realizes it was an accident, which is one of the issues with this movie. Like, he can't figure it out by this point. Like, come on. Like, Peter's explained it to him time and time again, and he just can't get that through his skull. But that being said, it is kind of cool to see this villain redeem himself and help Spider-Man to survive against Sandman and Venom, and ultimately self-sacrifice himself in the exact same way that his father died, being impaled by his own glider. This time by Venom directly, rather than by Spider-Man indirectly, if that makes any sense. I loved his death scene. I thought that was well handled. Mary Jane and Spider-Man were there. Peter Parker at this point, rather. Then he passes off. And I do like that one little note that he had in No Way Home, where of course he didn't show up again, but you had Norman Osborn saying, "My son, where is he?" Wish they could have played on that a little bit more, but that being said, this villain, he had really good moments towards the third act, but in the first and second act, like, it was just a lot of irritation with the amnesia thing, the dancing while making breakfast. Like, it was just not that great. So I loved his good moments, but they're ultimately overshadowed by the really weird, campy decisions that Spider-Man 3 made. So I won't give him an F tier, but I do really enjoy the moments that were good about this character. So I'll give him a D. And then I'm going to take a sip of water. As much as I have nostalgia for Venom during the Spider-Man 3 era of toys and stuff like that, this Venom was not Venom. It was, even watching the film as a kid, I felt like he was underutilized. I felt like he didn't look like Venom. I felt like the toy looked better than the Venom we actually got in the film, weirdly enough. I actually have one of those. And he's a little bit more jacked. He has a bigger maw. He has bigger teeth and everything. The toys look nothing like the Venom that we actually got in the film, which is kind of a showing sign that the film was rushed. And same with Venom. He was very much shoehorned into the film by the studio, and that's why the film came out as clunky as it did. Maybe in a better world, this film could have worked with both Venom and Sandman, because it was admittedly a little interesting to see that they both had a common enemy and they wanted to work together to defeat Spider-Man and all that. But this ultimately was not a great version of Venom. I don't think Topher Grace was quite the right pick. I guess as Eddie Brock, he was fine. Kind of similar to Peter Parker. He's a little wimpy, a little geeky, and all that. But once he becomes Venom, he's still kind of the same guy, just with some of this, like, angstiness to him that just, like, I don't mind angst in a villain, or a character rather, but for Venom, it just didn't translate well at all. Like, you expect him to be a lot more monstrous and ferocious and perhaps like twice his height and a lot more imposing, but here he just felt like a wet noodle. He was just kind of jumping around, not being very scary and not being very present for the majority of the film. Mostly you see symbiote Spider-Man rather than actual Venom, who doesn't show up until the third act of the film. So I do have nostalgia for the design of this Venom, even though it's not a good design for him, but that's literally the only redeeming thing for this particular iteration of the character, so I'm going to drop him in F. As for the Tom Hardy Venom, he's on this list, and I wouldn't count him on this list simply because he hasn't actually encountered Spider-Man yet, so if he were here, he'd probably be like in a question mark category or something like that. Now we move on to the Andrew Garfield movies with the Amazing Spider-Man 1, or TASM 1 as I lovingly call it. We have the Lizard. Kind of just a straightforward standalone villain. Pretty simple motive, which I think was pretty much the same thing as the comics. You have a scientist who wants to prove that his experiments work, and he tests his experiments on himself. We've heard the story before. That's kind of what knocks him down a few notches for me. But then again, you have that sympathetic element of how he's missing an arm. At least for this Curt Connors, we don't know how or why he's missing an arm. Like, maybe he lost it in the war, he was born that way, or he was in a car accident. I don't think they ever mention why his arm is gone here. But there are some really great moments, especially with the Horner score that we get in the background, that really do elevate this empathetic note that we have towards Lizard, towards Curt Connors, just dreaming of what it would be to be whole again, to have that arm, to be like anyone else. And then, of course, that drives him to experiment on himself And then he becomes a lizard, of course. And then he feels like, oh, this is a great adrenaline rush. Now the next great thing I can do for the world of science is to make everyone else into a lizard. And that is, I think, a very good balance between a very comic booky plot and a very practical plot. It feels like something that somebody would do. Like, for example, in Oppenheimer, it's such a weird tangent, but you have this guy who possesses all this science, and everybody knows its capabilities, but he wants to stretch it to the point where it will actually have a devastating, but then again, life-saving effect, in a really weird way. So, I don't know, you see the same thing here with Lizard, where he is perhaps to an extent conscious of what he's doing wrong here, but he just knows that the pros, at least what he sees as the pros, how they outweigh the cons. It's going to eliminate weakness in the world. It will eliminate illness. You'll no longer have people who are missing limbs or have obstructed vision or anything like that, or whatever benefits come from a lizard. So I feel like it ties back to Oppenheimer, again, that weird tangent I had. If someone did have the ability to turn everyone into a lizard, they see the science and they see what it can do for the world, someone's going to be crazy enough to act on it. So I found the plot very believable. As a character, though, again, this is kind of the third time you're seeing a scientist gone mad. It's a little bit overdone, but I still like the way he was acted. I still liked him in the movie that he was in. As for No Way Home, he had absolutely nothing to do. He was definitely the weakest of all the resurrected villains that we saw in that film, so I kind of ignore him there. But within The Amazing Spider-Man, I thought he was pretty cool, but not as good as the villains that we have in B tier, I think. Well, I think he's cooler than Sandman, but you know what? I do think I prefer him a little more than Sandman. I do think they're similar in that they have a very... You could say that about all three characters here in B tier. They all have a sympathetic angle. Like, Doc Ock just wants science to be a beautiful thing. You have Sandman, who simply wants to save his daughter. Then you have Lizard, who just wants his arm, at least initially. And then he wants all of humanity to benefit through radical evolution, pretty much. I feel like he is a greater threat than the other two, and I've never minded this redesign of Lizard. Like, yeah, it would have been cool to see him have the snout and everything, but I didn't mind his redesign, personally. So, yeah, I thought he was cool. I didn't mind him. Now we go on to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which is a personal favorite of mine. I know it's riddled with studio interference. There's a lot of tangents, stuff like that, but there's so many things that I love about this movie. I'll refrain on that from when we talk about the films themselves, but for now, let's just talk about the villains. We have Electro, who is a personal favorite of mine. Again, kind of a similar origin story that we've seen before to other villains. I literally call it Syndrome, where you have Syndrome from The Incredibles. You have kind of this little guy who's looking up to the hero, but they're ultimately rejected or something like that. And then they feel like, I'm going to become a villain now to get my revenge. But there's a little bit more to Max Dillon here, where you don't just have him looking up to Spider-Man, but you have that put against the world that Max Dillon otherwise has. He lives alone. The people at his work totally disregard him. They thieve him of his achievement in science. I don't totally understand what he did. Like, he built an electric grid or something to, like, harness power. Like, I guess he's, like, the Tesla of this Spider-Man universe or something. Like, he understands how electricity is used. I wish they would have went more into that. Like, why is his creation so important? But ultimately, that's taken from him. He's not given credit. So that puts him in a slump. He's like, oh, crap, that sucks. And it's also my birthday and no one cares. So you do feel bad for him. But then you have Spider-Man here, who's like this big hero for him. And he kind of simps for the guy. He's really excited whenever Spider-Man is mentioned. He even goes out of his way onto the radio to say that Spider-Man's getting a lot more flack than he deserves. He's a hero, he does good things. I don't know where all the hate's coming from. That's pretty much what Electro, or rather Max, says. But then we get to the scene in Times Square where everything is just a matter of misunderstanding, where Spider-Man is trying to do the right thing, even though he doesn't really remember Max Dillon much. He does remember him. He remembers, like, retrieving the blueprints for him and stuff like that. But even though he still thinks that he's a little bit off the handle and everything, he's still trying to say, hey, let's step aside. I know something weird's going on with you. And that's another thing. Like, they both are examples of science gone wrong. So he's like, let's step aside, let's talk it out, it'll be okay. But the minute that there's an accidental electrical surge that comes up from the ground, he's shot by a bullet, and then that's when Electro is effectively born. That's when he lashes out, and he believes that Spider-Man lied to him. That's when the one person he ever believed in, he believes that he was using him as a joke, that Spider-Man exemplified everything that the world is. And then the moment that the world does a one last cruel thing to him, which is shooting him, which has nothing to do with Spider-Man at all, that's when Electro is able to say, Spider-Man represents the world and its people, and the people are not good, then Spider-Man is my enemy. And then I love this Hans Zimmer score and the vocals that he used, and I love the dubstep too. I know a lot of people find the dubstep really annoying, they feel like it dates a movie, but for friggin' Electro, I think that works really well. I mean, literally just put the movie aside and listen to the score, like listen to the Electro Suite from Hans Zimmer, and you really do appreciate how just these little musical nuances elevate this character and make him so much more interesting than we get at face value. So anyways, going back to the film, he teams up with Harry Osborn, of course, who we'll talk about a little bit later, and he takes over the electrical grid, blacks out New York. Again, he's a very big threat, and then he's pretty much just killed outright. There's part of me who almost believes that maybe, perhaps the electricity seeped into somewhere, and he does live in the network somehow. I don't know, that would have been cool if they alluded to that. Then there's like the whole Sinister Six thing, he could have come back through there, but obviously that never happened. Then he came back in No Way Home, and his character was re-engineered. Obviously, he was aesthetically totally different. I kind of like the idea of how he's no longer blue, dabba-dee-dabba-die. Now he has yellow lightning, and they kind of explain it away pretty quick, but they say it's because it's a new universe, therefore it has different energy, so that's why he's yellow now. That makes him more comic accurate, but it also gets rid of the blueness that people didn't like. Personally, I didn't mind it. I mean, that's Ultimate Spider-Man, so I never really had an issue with the look of the character. But also, that's another cool thing about how he's elevated within No Way Home, is that he's one of the few characters who's like, no, I enjoy having this power. I want to keep being the bad guy. So he kind of catalyzes the other villains to sort of go off into this Sinister Six sort of group and team up against the Spider-Man. He's one who kind of pushes that. Green Goblin kind of goes off to do his own thing, but Electro kind of vocalizes how he likes being who he is. He likes his new lease on life. So, yeah, that just makes him a very interesting character. And then you have his last scene where Andrew Garfield, Peter 3 Spider-Man, goes up to him after he's cured, and he says, you were never a nobody, Max. And then he finally has that last moment with him before, again, he kind of evaporates into the stars or something. But I really do love Electro. I love him a lot. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was kind of my college movie. I don't know why, I just got really hooked on it. And I really did love Electro. I thought his portrayal was appropriately comic booky, very over the top, and I enjoyed it for that reason. Again, I love my over the top comic book villains, so I'm not going to give him an S tier, but I will give him an A. So that's where it is for me. Now we have Green Goblin version 2, I guess. I wouldn't even call him Green Goblin, he's simply just Goblin. Yeah, he's got green armor and all of that, but I call him Goblin simply because of the ferocity that he had by this point in the film. He's more animalistic than scheming or anything like that. But yeah, going into the origin, we have a very different Harry Osborn here. A little similar to, like, he's neglected by his father. In fact, he was, like, sent away. That's why we didn't see him in TASM 1. Then TASM 2, he comes back from, like a boot camp sort of thing. I don't know. They don't really explain his past a whole ton, which is another fault of the film. But yeah, he's kind of just on his own. Peter's his only buddy, and he has this really terrible undisclosed illness that is kind of exponentially taking a toll on him, a lot faster than it did on his father. So this is another case of a character who is very desperate to change something in his life. But in this case, the character is afflicted with a horrible, life-threatening illness. We don't really know what it is, but at least for his father, it gave him really creepy long fingernails or something like that. So I don't really understand the illness itself, but ultimately he's very sick, and he feels like the only cure to his illness is Spider-Man's blood. Not totally sure how he got to that conclusion, but effectively he says, like Spider-Man has a radical healing factor, he's lived for this long, his blood will allow me to carry on. So he goes to Peter and he says, you take pictures of him, therefore is there a chance you could reach out to him? Maybe he could save my life too. And then Spider-Man, of course, after learning that the blood only works with Peter Parker, because it was his father who synthesized the spiders to begin with, Spider-Man goes to Harry and says, this wouldn't be possible, it just wouldn't work out. I wish he would have explained it a little bit more. Simply he could have said, hey, I've studied my blood, genetically it just wouldn't work for you, it would hurt you more. Like he said that to an extent, but if he would have explained it more, then maybe Harry wouldn't have had his fall. But then he becomes the Goblin. He seeks out the glider, which was already specified a little earlier in the film when he had the sum total, as it was called, that microchip that his father gave him. He already knew that the suit had radical healing effects. Then again, he probably could have went to that suit straight away, but plot's got a plot. He gets in the suit. He flies after Spider-Man after he defeated Electro, and then of course he kills Spider-Gwen, where am I going? He kills Gwen Stacy, and that whole moment was great. When we talk about the film, we'll go more into that, but yeah, he gets knocked out, gets thrown in prison, and then this film definitely suffered from sequel syndrome when it really wanted to set a whole lot up for the future, so he could have come back as Goblin. That didn't wind up happening, but I really do love this interpretation of the Green Goblin. I like how he's a lot more feral, a lot more less refined. I do like his anti-arc, even though I do think there were things that could have been done a little bit better, but I like how he's just totally back to the bone at this point. Like, he's irredeemable. Like, I think the arc we got with New Goblin was better, but then again, it was kind of hampered with campiness of Spider-Man 3. But with Goblin here, or Green Goblin version 2, whatever you want to call him, I feel like it was better stretched out across the film. And assuming that the movie expected more movies to happen in this continuity, I like the way that they did this character. I would have liked to see more of him, to see if he could be redeemed, or if he was too far gone. So I like that to be a continued aspect of this character. So I'm going to move him not as high as Electro, but I think I prefer him more than Lizard, so I'll give him A tier as well. Now we have the Rhino! Yeah, he's gonna get an F tier straight away. Fun gag of a character, but I mean, he's got no bearing on the plot whatsoever. Then he also is responsible for one of the worst endings to a superhero movie in history. That ending, I guess we could talk about that briefly. I'm bittersweet on it. Obviously, it's not good. They could have done something better. But, I mean, when you have that manhole swing at Rhino, it's almost like suggesting that, like, if these Spider-Man movies were to be the only two and that was it, then this could have been the film's way of saying, like, you know, even though there's going to be more threats abound, such as the Rhino, such as the Sinister Six, Spider-Man, Peter Parker has overcome his demons to an extent. He's learned to get past Gwen, to hold on to hope, and he's going to be okay. So we don't need to see this fight transpire. We know that Spider-Man will continue to be himself in spite of his loss. So that's really the best that can be said about Rhino here. That you can twist it to the point where he's kind of a metaphor of Spider-Man's redemption, but other than that, there's nothing really great about the character. He's a pretty easy F. So now we're going to move into the MCU, which, kind of like Dark Knight, not my cup of tea. Just a little bit too much of that craziness, too many characters going on for me to really appreciate each character on their own. So, yeah, just simply on the fact that I haven't seen these films as much, I'm going to go through them a little bit faster. But anyway, so you have Michael Keaton's Vulture. I've got mixed feelings about this character. I know people love Homecoming. For me, I don't know, just because we had the two other Spider-Men and they had their origin stories and everything, but Tom Holland's Spider-Man didn't really have that. So when you have, like, just simply Spider-Man, don't really know where he came from, what his backstory is, he's just there, then he gets a villain thrown into the mix. It's hard to consider the villain to be a foil or anything like that. It's hard to relate the villain to the hero very well, and the way that they did relate the villain to the hero, I feel like it was a little too forced. Again, it's a simple man, simple scientist who just wants to benefit his daughter, similarly to Sandman, with the daughter angle, and then with a whole bunch of other villains here with the scientist angle. Not really scientist, more like technological than anything, but all that being said, my big issue with this character is just plot convenience, where Peter Parker starts dating his daughter, and then Vulture figures out that Spider-Man and Peter Parker are one and the same, and then he threatens him, which is a very good scene. It's very well done, but it was just so forced to me, and it didn't help me to connect this particular villain with Spider-Man very much. Yeah, I just, like, he's well acted and everything. He looked pretty damn cool, but I didn't feel like he was as nuanced as he could have been, and he was too similar to other characters that we've seen before, so he's just fine. He serves his MCU role okay, so I'll give him a C tier. I wouldn't give him D, because he's definitely not a bad character, but I wouldn't give him B, because I don't really enjoy the character as much as I wish I did, so give him C. I think that's fine. Shocker, I think there's two Shockers if I'm correct, but both of them combined in this one image. A shame, because I do love Shocker as a character. I wish we would have gotten more of him, like, as a bona fide, like, outfitted villain for Spider-Man, because I really like his abilities to, like, cause those tremors and everything like that, or whatever you want to call it. But they were pretty much just henchmen. I'd barely put them on this list at all, but they're here, so you might as well talk about them. I mean, they were pretty much the Vulture's henchmen, kind of beating up Spider-Man just a little bit, but that's kind of all. But they weren't as distracting as Rhino, but they weren't as important as Venom, so I will give them a mid-F. Mysterio was pretty cool. Again, it's a case of syndrome, where you've got a character who is working under their hero, in this case being Iron Man, and they want a whole revenge plot and everything, so it's something we've seen before. His powers are neat. I mean, it's similar to Quentin Beck's origins in the comics, where he was instead a theater actor who could specialize in special effects and stuff, so I really like his power set and everything like that. He's not really powerful, he's just technologically brilliant. I think that's really cool. And he's ultimately killed, but not without leaving a last love letter telling the whole world that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are one and the same. So that was pretty cool that a villain figured it out and they ratted him out finally, and then that would influence the events of No Way Home. So it's kind of cool that he has a lasting effect into a later movie after his defeat. But yeah, I don't care for this character a whole lot. Again, kind of similar to Vulture, he serves his purpose, but he's a little bit too familiar, but not nuanced enough to take him out of those stereotypes of Spider-Man villains we've seen already. But I will say I do prefer him a little more than Vulture, so give him a higher C. So that's it for the live action villains. Now we go on to Across the Spider-Verse, Into the Spider-Verse. We're starting with Into. We have the Green Goblin, kind of just hulks around, temporary threat for the first Peter Parker Spider-Man that we see in the film, but then I forget exactly what happens to him. I think he's just knocked out, then we don't really see him again. That's kind of it. He's kind of a nothing character, but I don't know where to place him. I mean, he serves his purpose okay. I mean, F is for characters that could have been more. D is for characters that I thought were cool and served their purpose well enough, but they weren't bad. Like, this Green Goblin wasn't a bad character, they just weren't that significant, so I'll give them a low D, but New Goblin was a little more significant to the plot. Kingpin. I didn't love Kingpin, I'll be honest. I get it, he has that sympathetic edge where he screwed up trying to fight Spider-Man, but he scared his family away as a result of that. That's kind of the issue with this villain, along with a lot of other villains on this list, is you don't see how they initially became who they are. They kind of just exist, and simply so. And for other people, they might not mind that, and that's okay. But for me, I really do need to see how this villain came to be, or any villain rather. I need that origin story in order for me to properly relate the hero to the villain. And for Kingpin here, we didn't really get that. He poses a surmountable threat. He's trying to, break the wall between universes so he can find a copy of his family to be with him, which is pretty messed up in its own way. Definitely one of the most dangerous villains here. So he poses a threat. He's a good villain. Definitely better than the third Green Goblin that we got, or like fourth Green Goblin. There's Goblin oversaturation in these films for sure. But in terms of how much I care about the character, I do think I prefer New Goblin a little more, just based on nostalgia's sake. And again, I love him in the third act. So, but yeah, otherwise, don't really care about Kingpin, very much. Prowler. So we have a very interesting take on Ben Parker, where instead we have Miles' Uncle Aaron, who actually happens to be a villain. Once more, I take very big issue in that we don't see how Uncle Aaron became Prowler. He just simply is the Prowler. Cool reveal and all, but we don't know. We never saw him team up with Kingpin or anything like that. So I had issue with the starting point of this villain. He's simply there. We learn, oh, he's somebody that we knew all along. And then very shortly after that, he gets shot and killed. And that's the last we see of him. So, and then Miles grieves over his death. And then, of course, all the other Spider folks help him out through that grief. So, he serves as a good launching point for Miles. But as a character in himself, Aaron's a good character. Prowler, I don't think is. I was a little underwhelmed. I thought he could have been so much more. So on the fact that I wanted a lot more from him and we didn't get it, I'm going to put him a little lower. So I'm going to put him higher than Goblin version 4 or whatever he is. Just because Prowler is cooler. I'll put him higher than Kingpin. But not as high as New Goblin. Okay. Then we have Olivia Octavius. Very cool character. Kind of short-lived. Didn't have a whole lot to do with the plot. I don't really remember what happened to her. I think... Oh, yeah, she was, like, hit by a truck or a bus or something like that, and then she disappeared. Did she die? I don't know, but... yeah, she didn't have a whole lot of bearing on the plot. She just looked cool. It was neat to see another alternate version of the classic Spider-Man character, but... Yeah, aside from her performance, which was very charismatic and all that, didn't do a whole ton, was not much of a threat, definitely not as big of a threat compared to Prowler or Kingpin. She was kind of just there to be a temporary hindrance, so I'll also give her a D tier. Served her purpose fine, could have been more. I'd say I'd put her below Kingpin. These next two I kind of bucket together. We have Scorpion, then we have Tombstone. Neither of them nearly as cool as Olivia Octavius, but yeah, I feel like this Goblin served a better purpose, a better function than these two side character villains, in that at least this Goblin showed the original Peter Parker of this universe doing his thing, so he's pretty important in that way. But as for these two villains, they were kind of just henchmen to Kingpin, but not nearly as cool as Olivia Octavius. So I'm going to put them both below this Goblin. So Scorpion, it was kind of cool how Miles spoke to him in Spanish and all that. So they had a few quips together. But so I'll put him below the Goblin. But as for Tombstone, I remember absolutely nothing about him. So I'll put him below Scorpion. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out what's the difference between F tier and D tier. D tier, I appreciated the roles that they served. So, as just stand-in villains, everyone here was fine. Whereas the main villains, they served their purpose all right. I just didn't care about them enough. As for F, they severely disappointed me, or they just weren't done nearly as well as they could have been, or they were just flat-out stupid. So, I don't know, not a whole lot of difference between D and F here, but there are just some villains who are a lot better. Now, there are two more villains I do want to talk about. They just don't happen to be here, so we'll at least discuss them. We have, firstly, the Spot. I friggin' love this Spot in Across the Spider-Verse. The scientist who was hit by a bagel. I watched this movie in theaters with my cousin, and we both lost our minds when we learned that he was the scientist hit with the bagel. So, yeah, this movie yields a lot of good memories for me. Especially since I didn't see Into the Spider-Verse in theaters, so I managed to see Across in theaters, and that was really huge for me. But, yeah, the Spot, I just love the fact that, kind of similarly to Electro, we don't expect a whole lot from him. We just expect him to be this pretty low-key little threat, kind of just this nerd with a funny power. But then you see him start to really pollute the multiverse and become absolutely horrifying and scary. And you don't see a whole lot of him because we're so focused on Miles Morales and his whole plot within Across the Spider-Verse. Again, we'll talk about that another time. Let me know if you want that sooner than later. But yeah, the Spot, yeah, I think he was a perfect example of just this nerd who becomes an absolute terrifying threat. And obviously we're going to be seeing him again in the next Spider-Verse movie. I forget what it's titled. But I just thought everything about him was really awesome. I'd give him, I'd say a low A. So I'd put him right behind the Dane DeHaan Goblin. That would feel right to me. And the last character we have is 2099. It's hard to argue whether or not he's a villain. He's an antagonist, but not a straight-out villain. He's not a bad guy, but he is a hindrance to the protagonist, so that's why he is an antagonist. He's a guy who simply knows the consequences of messing with the multiverse. He tried to save his own family, or was it a daughter? I don't remember exactly. I've only seen the film once in theaters, and that was it. But he tried to save someone near and dear to him, and he wound up rapturing an entire universe as a result of that. And he set up this entire program with all these spider people to ensure that nobody else tries doing what he does, because it's part of the Spider-Man arc that a spider person loses someone that starts them on their way. And as for this Miles Morales here, he is destined to lose his father, which is not good, but at the same time, 2099 argues that, no, you're supposed to lose your father, let it happen, don't change a thing. And he is doing the pragmatically correct, upright thing. So, yeah, he's an excellently done... Again, I can't say he's a villain because he doesn't think he's doing a bad thing, and he's not doing a bad thing. Arguably, this is the right thing to be doing, but he is ultimately going against what Miles Morales is trying to do, being to save his father and to be less pragmatic, to do what would seem like to be the straightforward right thing to do, which is simply just saving a person, stopping them from dying. But if that person is fated to die to further along somebody who's more important, being this Spider-Man, then should you let them die? It's such an interesting plot point. So, man, he's such a good character. I'd say I'd put him below Spot. So, obviously you can't see them here, but I'd say Electro, Dane DeHaan's Goblin, Spot, and then 2099, simply because I prefer Spot more, he scared me more, and I'm a lot more curious about him. Honestly, 2099 is pretty much on equal footing with Spot objectively for me, but I just prefer Spot more, so pretty simple there. But yeah, that is our list. Again, subjective, not objective at all. If it were objective, things would be pretty different, except for the fact that I think Goblin would probably stay in S tier, although he might be joined by like 2099, and maybe one or two other characters, like Otto Octavius would be up there as well, but I think Goblin would hold his place in an objective list. But otherwise, yeah, this is just how I enjoy the characters and nothing more than that, really. So, yeah, that's about it for this list, coming up to an hour, as all of these lists mysteriously do, so I think that's fine and all well and good. So, yeah, let me know who your favorite Spider-Man villains are, who your least favorite villains are. Like, a lot of people drop this Goblin and Electro at the bottom from TASM 2, and I totally understand the reasons why. I just happen to absolutely love them. They're in a film that I really do enjoy, even though I know there's a lot of studio interference. But yeah, these lists are fun to do, as I keep saying. But yeah, just let me know what your list would look like, or at the very least, who would be on the top, who would be on the bottom. And yeah, that's about all. So I'm going to leave you there, folks. Let me know if there are any other tier lists that you would like me to do in the future. Again, they're just nice to fill in some space when you don't have any figures to talk about. Again, I'm sorry, it's just something that we can't do every single week. That's just not possible. But this is a nice little substitute to do. So again, if you have more podcast ideas of any sort, even if it's not a tier list ranking or anything like that, then go ahead and let me know. And that's about all. So as per usual, if you enjoyed, then go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, whatever. There's also a dead Patreon if you want to check that out as well. And that's all I have to say. So that's about all. Rock on, and I will see you all later.